Oftentimes in the true crime community, we find ourselves sitting in the grey area. We generally don't have enough information to reach a concrete verdict in the cases we read about. Often though, when there are cases that go to court, the public are confident it will be a slam dunk. After all, if the police and prosecutors have enough information for it to go to trial, what more could they need? But today's episode will show that's not always enough, as we take a look at 3 famous trials that shockingly resulted in the defendant's freedom. Henry Kendall Thaw. Henry Kendall Thaw was born in Pennsylvania in 1871 and was the son of coal and railroad baron William Thaw Sr. and the heir to a multi-million-dollar fortune. Thaw was known to be erratic even in childhood, suffering from insomnia, incoherent babbling, and temper tantrums. Teachers called him unintelligent and a troublemaker as he bounced between private schools, and he eventually attended the University of Pittsburgh before transferring to Harvard, although he was later expelled. He barely studied during his time at university, instead opting to attend cockfights and go on drinking binges. He was labeled a playboy and would often light cigarettes with $100 bills, and once chased down a cab driver with a shotgun because he believed he had cheated him out of 10 cents, even though he was on a $2,500 per month allowance at the time, when the average yearly wage was just $500. Following his expulsion from Harvard, Thaw was snubbed by New York City elites. He blamed a man named Stanford White for this, a renowned architect who didn't support Thaw's entry into these selective groups. His obsession with White only grew, however, when he met model Florence Evelyn Nesbitt. Evelyn had known White since she was 15 years old, and when she was around 16, he had piled her with alcohol and sexually assaulted her while she was unconscious. Evelyn's mother and headmistress were thoroughly impressed by Thaw, an older and excessively wealthy man. He always visited her bearing gifts, money, and praise, and eventually they traveled Europe together, where he asked Evelyn to marry him. She initially declined because she knew Thaw was obsessed with female chastity, but eventually revealed to him what had happened with White, which enraged him. He felt that Evelyn had been ruined by White, as she was no longer a virgin. The couple married in 1905. On June 25th, 1906, Evelyn and Thaw went to see a show with some friends in Madison Square Garden, which began to wind down at around 11 p.m. At this time, White appeared and took a seat at a nearby table. Thaw, who'd been agitated all day, approached White during the show's finale and pulled out a gun. He fired 3 shots at White at a distance of 2 feet. Afterwards, he stood over the architect's body, didn't flee the scene or attempt to deny responsibility, instead proclaiming, "I did it because he ruined my wife." Although some witnesses have claimed he possibly stated life rather than wife. He then added he had it coming to him. He took advantage of the girl and then abandoned her. Thaw was charged with first-degree murder and denied bail. While in prison awaiting trial, he had his meals prepared by his favorite restaurants, slept on a brass bed instead of a standard prison cot, and dressed in his own tailored clothes rather than the prison uniform, and was allowed to consume champagne and wine. He was reportedly elated in the days following the murder and claimed that he heard heavenly voices of young girls calling out to him afterwards. He felt this was a sign of divine approval. Meanwhile, Thaw's mother, who had been protecting the family name for years by paying off anyone that her son hurt, hired the best lawyer in the business to defend him, which cost the family $750,000 in today's money. Mrs. Thaw initially insisted that her son not be stigmatized by clinical insanity, as his lawyers believed that was the best defense, so the pair reached a compromise, deciding that Thaw would plead temporary insanity. Reportedly, Mrs. Thaw's side of the family had a history of mental illness, which her son had inherited. Over the years, he had abused Evelyn, both sexually and physically, had what are described as sadistic sexual impulses, and often lured victims into an area so he could strap them down and physically assault them. Tens of thousands of dollars had been spent keeping victims quiet. At the end of Thaw's first trial, the jury deadlocked. His second trial took place in January of 1908 and lasted until February 1st, when he was found not guilty by reason of insanity and sentenced to life at the Matawan State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Fishkill, New York, although his extraordinary wealth allowed him privileges that ordinary patients were unable to benefit from. Following his placement there, his legal team began working on having Thaw proven sane, and in 1915, following a trial which would determine his sanity, he was deemed sane and released back into the public. Just 1 year later, Thaw was charged with kidnapping, beating, and sexually assaulting a 19-year-old named Frederick Gump. Thaw fled Philadelphia and attempted to take his own life after bribing the Gump family failed. He was once more put into a mental institution, but was later deemed sane again and released in 1924. Thaw died of a heart attack in Miami, Florida in 1947. He was 76 years old. He left the modern equivalent of around $121,000 of his $12 million fortune to Evelyn and was buried in Pittsburgh. William Kennedy Smith. On March 29, 1991, 29-year-old mother of one Patricia Bowman was enjoying a drink in a bar in Palm Beach, Florida with a friend. She didn't expect her life to be turned upside down in just a few hours when she met 30-year-old William Kennedy Smith. Smith was a medical student at Georgetown University and a member of the Kennedy family. Specifically, he was the nephew of former President John F. Kennedy. Smith was in the bar that night drinking with his cousin Patrick and his uncle, Senator Ted Kennedy. After Smith met Patricia, he asked her for a lift back to a nearby house his family owned. Patricia agreed, and upon arrival, the pair began walking along the beach. Smith asked the 29-year-old if she wanted to go swimming. Patricia recalled that up until that point she'd felt safe, but she didn't want to go into the water. She couldn't swim and it would be cold. She also didn't want to get undressed around him. Smith, however, seemed to have no issue with undressing in front of her. Patricia said in her 1992 interview with Vanity Fair, "I didn't necessarily want to see him in his boxer shorts, so I turned my back. And then I thought, well, it's late, he's going swimming, I should go. I started going toward the stairs, and then my leg was grabbed. I struggled to get away from him. That should be a sign to a rational person, don't do this. He had been a nice man, and all of a sudden, this man has grabbed my leg. He's on top of me. He's hurting my body." Patricia testified that she had kissed Smith at one point during the evening, but had never once consented to sex. Following the alleged rape at around 4 a.m., the 29-year-old called two of her friends to come and collect her. They took her to their home before dropping her off at her own residence, where she called a rape crisis center. A few hours later, Patricia reported the incident to the police and went to the hospital for a rape kit examination, which discovered sperm inside her, as well as bruising, while she complained of severe pain. 9 months passed before Smith's trial began. The prosecution was led by Assistant State Attorney of Palm Beach County, Moira Lash, who had an almost 100% track record of conviction. The 40-year-old was known to be good at her job, but was noted to come across as less likable due to her frosty demeanor. Smith was represented by defense attorney Roy Black, who was better known as the Professor, and had a reputation for defending murderers and drug traffickers. 5 private investigators were hired to look into Patricia's past and the history of her 2 friends who'd collected her from the Kennedy home on the night of the alleged assault, while about a dozen expert witnesses were called in to cast doubt on the 29-year-old's story. Notably, Moira Lash attempted to have Judge Mary Lupo replaced before the trial began, on the grounds that she was prejudiced in favor of the defense, a conclusion she reached as the judge was often seen scowling, glaring, and frowning at Lash and her co-counsel. The motion was denied, and the journalists who were present at the trial noticed that it was evident that Lash and Lupo did not like each other. Dominic June, in his Vanity Fair article, pointed out that it likely would have worked out better had Lash attempted to remove Lupo from the case by noting that the husband of her co-counsel was legally feuding with the judge's husband over money. Reportedly, another misstep in the prosecution was that Ann Mercer, one of Patricia's friends who'd picked her up on the night of the alleged assault, was a less than favorable witness. Although she was one of the key witnesses for the prosecution, she was seen as hostile and arrogant, and it quickly came to light that she had taken money in exchange for giving TV interviews, one of which aired on the day the trial began. This meant Smith's defense team were able to remove her credibility and brand her as an individual who was only motivated by money. Smith's attorney, Roy Black, was also accused of only allowing jurors in who liked the Kennedys and removing those who criticized the family. Senator Ted Kennedy was called as a witness, but spent much of his time discussing the tragedies that plagued the family and looking grief-stricken as he did so, despite most of what he said having nothing to do with the case. After his uncle left the stand, Smith reportedly said into the microphone, "I think this process has been unfair to him. I don't say that in a bitter way, I just mean it in my heart." Black also sought to discredit Patricia by claiming she'd had several abortions and a history of substance abuse. He also pointed out that she had a daughter who'd been born out of wedlock. During the trial, Smith claimed his encounter with Patricia was entirely consensual and that she'd become furious when he called her Kathy by mistake. Patricia denied this. Also at this time, 3 women came forward and were willing to testify that they had been sexually assaulted by Smith between 1983 and 1988. They were, respectively, a doctor, a medical student, and a law student, the latter of whom was the girlfriend of Smith's cousin, Matthew Kennedy. However, Judge Lupo disallowed the testimony without comment. Smith was eventually acquitted of all charges by the 6-member jury, who deliberated for 77 minutes. Afterwards, he went on to become a doctor who specialized in working with victims of landmines. He stayed out of the spotlight for the most part. Notably, in 1995, his defense attorney, Roy Black, married one of the jurors. In 2004, a former employee for the Center of International Rehabilitation, who'd worked as Smith's assistant, alleged that he'd sexually assaulted her in 1999 and filed a civil lawsuit against him. He denied the allegations, labeling them as outrageous. The case was dismissed in January of 2005, but a spokesperson for the CIR stated that 2 separate federal sexual harassment claims against Smith had been made by former employees and had been, quote, settled amicably. Eadweard Muybridge. On May 20th, 1871, 41-year-old photography pioneer Eadweard Muybridge married 21-year-old divorcee Flora Shallcross Stone. Muybridge was born in 1830 in Surrey, England, the son of a fairly well-off family, with his father working as a successful merchant. Although his father died when he was only 13 years old, Muybridge seemed to be determined to make a name for himself. He left the UK when he was 22 and headed to the United States for a new adventure. Likely due to the 20-year age gap, Muybridge had little in common with his new wife. While she was interested in entertaining guests and visiting the theatre, the photographer was more interested in his work and reading heavy literature. He often spent weeks away from home, traveling so that he could take photos. A few years after they tied the knot, on April 14, 1874, Flora gave birth to the couple's first and only child, a son named Florado Helius Muybridge. Although it's unclear when exactly, Flora began to have an affair early on in the couple's marriage. Major Harry Larkins, a reporter for the Evening Post, was a family friend and had quickly grown close with the mother of one. Muybridge reportedly discovered the affair and intervened several times, believing it was over for good when he sent his wife to stay with relatives, while Larkins took up a new job at a mine near Calistoga, California. However, in October of 1874, Muybridge was approached by Flora's maternity nurse, who revealed that the couple had been carrying on during her pregnancy and exchanging love letters, some of which the nurse had in her possession. She also had a photograph of the baby, and Flora had scribbled on the back of it, "Little Harry," leading Muybridge to believe that he was not Florado's biological father. On October 17th, Muybridge went to track down Larkins. When he found him, he stated, I have a message for you from my wife." He then shot Larkins at point-blank range near his heart. The man died that night, and Muybridge was arrested and placed in jail. Approached by a journalist the following day, Muybridge seemed in good spirits. He claimed the officers were kind to him, and he reportedly had a good influence over the other inmates as he intervened on bullying and abuse and chastised outbursts of profanity. He was calm as he explained his plan to kill Larkin, claimed he had no regrets, and believed that men of family would understand his decision to kill his wife's lover. Muybridge's trial began in February of 1875. His lawyer entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, because the photographer had suffered a head injury after a coach accident in 1860, which had caused his behavior to change. Several long-term acquaintances testified on his behalf, claiming that he had dramatically changed from a gentle, mild-mannered individual to a frenzied and erratic one who was prone to violent outbursts. Muybridge, for his part, claimed his actions were premeditated and deliberate, but he often displayed uncontrolled explosions of emotion throughout the trial, which bolstered his defense team's arguments. The defense team also argued that Major Larkins was a man of bad character and that he bragged to his friends about seducing Flora. They claimed that his deceit had made Muybridge insane from anger, and the photographer was motivated by only the love he had for his wife. The nurse who had the love letters was also questioned on the stand, and the letters were entered into evidence. In the end, Muybridge was acquitted on the grounds of justifiable homicide, even though, by law, adultery was not a justifiable reason to commit murder. Furthermore, the judge had specifically instructed the jury that even if Larkins had seduced Flora, he was not justified in taking the law into his own hands. The jury was given 4 options to choose from when considering the verdict and sentencing. None of these options involved justifiable homicide. Still, the jury argued that if their verdict was not in line with the law, it was in line with human nature. They believed they couldn't punish a person for doing something they themselves would likely do in similar circumstances. After his acquittal, Muybridge continued to live his life as normal. He left the US for 9 months on a pre-planned trip to Central America, where he worked on his photography. Flora initially petitioned for divorce on December 14, 1874, on the grounds of extreme cruelty, but this was dismissed. Her second petition was successful, however. She died suddenly in July of 1875. In 1876, Muybridge had Florado moved from a Catholic orphanage to a Protestant one and paid for his care, but otherwise had little to do with him. It is said that, as an adult, he was the spitting image of Muybridge. Florado worked as a ranch hand and gardener and died in Sacramento in 1944 after he was hit by a car. Muybridge died from cancer in 1904 after retiring to his hometown in Surrey, England. And there you have the facts. Please leave a comment down below with your own thoughts and reactions, and remember to like this video and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.